The German forest in spring 1945 smelled of pine, mud, and the metallic scent of defeat. We were clearing a collapsed barn when we found them. Not soldiers ready for a final stand, but ghosts in tattered Red Cross uniforms. Their eyes, wide and hollow, held a terror that went beyond the battlefield. They had been taught to expect monsters. They were prepared for the end. What they weren't prepared for was the sight of an American sergeant offering not a weapon, but a bar of chocolate and a canteen of clean water. This wasn't a battle. It was an archaeology of despair. For months, the Western Front had been a meat grinder chewing its way east. But by April of 1945, the German war machine was not just broken. It was disintegrating. Entire divisions melted away, supply lines vanished, and command structures evaporated into panicked whispers. Caught in this maelstrom were the forgotten casualties of a dying empire. The medical units. Their retreat was a slow-motion nightmare, a chaotic exodus burdened by thousands of wounded men. They moved from one ruined building to the next, converting barns, cellars, and abandoned schools into charnel houses where hope went to die. For the German Red Cross nurses trapped in this chaos, their duty had become an impossible burden. They were healers without medicine, comforters with no comfort to give. The world had shrunk to the four walls of their makeshift aid station, a primitive stage for human suffering. Infection was rampant. The last of the sulfa drugs had been used weeks ago. Pain was managed not with morphine, but with whispered apologies. Bandages were boiled strips of clothing, and makeshift stretchers were crude frames of wood and wire, often carrying men who would not survive the journey to the next stop. These women worked until their bodies screamed for rest, fueled by a dwindling reserve of professional pride and a pervasive, gnawing hunger. They were not just witnesses to the collapse, they were its victims, suffering from the same exhaustion and starvation as the soldiers they desperately tried to save. The psychological toll was immense, compounded by the relentless drone of Allied bombers and the ever-present rumble of approaching armor. But another, more insidious fear stalked them. It was a fear drilled into their minds by years of relentless propaganda. They had been told stories of the Allied invaders, particularly the Americans, depicted as undisciplined brutes, cultural degenerates who would show no mercy. In the twisted logic of the crumbling Reich, capture was a fate worse than death, a prelude to unspeakable horrors. This indoctrination created a powerful wall of terror, isolating them even further. As the American sergeant, a man barely out of his teens, saw not the enemy, but a group of exhausted, terrified women on the brink of collapse. He lowered his rifle. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it shattered the wall of propaganda. He reached into his pack and offered what little comfort he had. It wasn't an order or a threat. It was a simple, human transaction that defied everything they had been taught to believe. In their starved hands, the weight of the chocolate bar felt heavier than a metal. The cool metal of the canteen more precious than gold. It was the first act of an encounter that would challenge the very nature of their war. This initial offering was more than a gesture. It was a bridge across a chasm of hatred. The nurses were escorted away from the ruins of their former world, their steps unsteady, their minds reeling. Every footstep toward the American lines was a step into the unknown, a journey against every instinct that had been conditioned by years of war. They were led to a nearby clearing, and what they saw there stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't a makeshift camp. It was an entire city of white canvas tents, humming with disciplined, efficient activity. This was an American aid station, a testament to a logistical power they could no longer comprehend. The contrast was staggering, almost violent in its implications. Their own medical practice had devolved into something medieval, a desperate struggle against decay with boiled rags and unsterilized blades in a filthy barn. Here, they walked into a world of pristine order. They saw medics in clean uniforms moving with purpose. They saw stacks of wooden crates overflowing with supplies, boxes of sterile gauze, tins of sulfa powder, and countless vials of penicillin, a miracle drug they had only heard about in rumors. Surgical instruments were not just boiled in a pot, but laid out in gleaming, sterile kits. The air didn't smell of gangrene and death. It smelled of antiseptic and soap. For the German nurses, it was a profound, soul-shaking shock. This wasn't just a difference in supplies, it was a difference in philosophy, a demonstration of a system that still valued and could protect human life, even as their own had descended into nihilistic survival. They were gently guided into a tent, not for interrogation, but for triage. American medics, some no older than the boys they had been treating, assessed them with a quiet professionalism that transcended enmity. Their worn boots were removed, their calloused hands cleaned. They were given fresh, warm blankets that felt like an impossible luxury. Then came the food. It wasn't scraps or hardtack, but a steaming ladle of hot stew, thick with potatoes and meat, served with a slice of real bread. This simple meal was the final blow to the fortress of propaganda that had imprisoned their minds. The monsters they were promised did not materialize. The savages were nowhere to be found. In their place were men who saw not a German uniform, but a fellow human being suffering from exhaustion and starvation. In the following days, their physical recovery was swift, but the psychological healing was far more significant. The terror in their eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet disbelief, and then by a profound, unspoken gratitude. They had prepared for the worst humanity had to offer, and had instead received its best. This small, unrecorded incident, on a forgotten front, was, in its own way, as significant as any battle. It was a preview of the war's end, not as a clash of armies, but as a meeting of people. In time, these nurses were transferred to formal internment camps, processed and eventually released to find their way in the ruins of post-war Germany. They carried with them not just the memory of defeat, but the startling, indelible memory of an enemy who chose compassion over retribution, reminding the world that even at the end of the darkest chapter in history, the duty to heal could be more powerful than the order to hate.